So we're reading Daniel 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We'll never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, should be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians and cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order. They brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They've not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and people of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he's the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Amen. Thank you, Duncan. It's quite a long reading, but I thought it was worth reading because this is a story that we all kind of know, right? If you've been around church at all, if you went to primary school, Sunday school, you know Daniel and the lion's den. That's a story that we know. But I think it's probably one of those stories that's just about famous enough that in the wider society, people have some concept of Daniel and the lion's den. But I wanted us to read the whole story because actually we see how it's actually a story of political intrigue and infighting. And that's exactly where we find ourselves. It was very, 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 very tempting to try and draw some parallels with perhaps current affairs. However, we shan't be doing that. I decided to behave myself and not do that. But we've been looking throughout the past 7 weeks at this question of how do we live faithfully in exile? And we were saying that we experience this exile too. We're told by Peter that we are aliens and strangers in this land, that we are also exiles. So how do we live faithfully in the midst of a very complicated world? And we've looked at lots of different aspects of this. And we arrive at this story today, and this is the question we want to ask again, is what are we learning here about how we live faithfully in exile? How do you live faithfully tomorrow morning when you're at work and the pressure's on? When somebody wants you to do something you're just not quite comfortable about. Do you remember we talked a few weeks ago, where are your red lines? How are you going to figure that out? Or when there's just too much of your time being taken and you're just not sure how to make good decisions, where are you going to go with that? When your children are asking you questions about the complexity of this world, and we don't want to ignore that and pretend like it's simple, it's really difficult. How are we going to live faithfully in the middle of that? And this is the question that I think we've seen throughout Daniel. And we find ourselves today at a really significant turning point in history, because we've just finished with the Babylonian Empire. It just gets a couple of sentences at the end of chapter 5, and that's it. It's done. Along comes the Medo-Persian Empire. Complete change. Many people see that as if you remember back to the dream that Archie didn't really talk about because I wouldn't let him, ask us about that story later, in chapter 2, where we see this great statue with the different sections. And some people suggest that this is the first change in that statue, that we've moved from the Babylonian Empire to the Medo-Persian Empire. But that's what we got. So we've now got these two people that are going to appear in our story. Darius is the main one, who seems to be ruling over Babylon, and we've got a King Cyrus that we hear about at the end. It's complex. They might be the same person. They might not be the same person. It's not entirely clear, to be perfectly honest. I've read about half a dozen books this week. I'm still not sure whether Darius and Cyrus are the same person, or Cyrus is some sort of king and Darius is a slightly under king. That's probably my best bet at it. But anyway, we've got Darius and Cyrus, who are these Medo-Persian rulers. Darius has some control over what's going on around Daniel. They create this structure with 120 satraps or rulers who are going to rule a section of the kingdom, and then 3 who will be over that. And it looks like Daniel's about to be made the equivalent of the prime minister or first minister, the kind of chief in control. Not ultimate control, because there's still a monarch somewhere, but in control organizationally there. And we must remember, by this point, Daniel's an old man. Bell told us that last week. In Daniel 5, he's already a really old man. So he's now much older again. So this is a guy in his 80s, probably by this point. But he's so well renowned that they've kept him around. So not only was he brought from Judah as a little boy into Babylon and trained to be a leader and became a leader, but now that the Babylonian Empire has been brought down, this new empire comes along, they say, actually, but this guy's pretty switched on. We're going to keep him around. And so he gets to stay on, and he's about to be promoted. However, what happens is, what often happens when power is involved, some people went, we don't fancy him having power. We'd like to have power. And so they set up a sting, if you like. They go to Darius and they say, we have all decided. I don't know if you noticed that right at the beginning. It says, we have all decided. But they didn't all decide at all, because actually the one who had the power there, Daniel, wasn't part of this decision. And so they've gone behind Daniel's back and they go to Darius and say, we have all decided that this is what we should do, and we should big you up. And there's all this flattery of Darius and how they should set this up so that he is to be the only one that people are to pray to. Why would they do that? It's jealousy. It's a craving for power. And friends, be aware of that. This is endemic in the world. It happens everywhere. If you work in a big organization, if you move up a little bit, you watch out, because people will come for you. Not just because you're a Christian. There may be opportunities, but this is just happens all the time in big organizations. I had the fortune to work for a great company called Zurich, a big commercial insurance company, and I got promoted a few times. I was doing quite well in my work, but I promise you there were times really horrible, where people just go out their way to try and make you fail. And I genuinely don't understand that mentality, but I know that exists. And I know from talking to some people in here, in our church, they work in organizations where that has happened. And it's awful. So be wise. Jesus tells us to be gentle as doves, but wise as serpents. So be wise. Keep your eye out for that stuff. This is one of the ways that we live faithfully. Anyway, so it goes through. Darius decides, yes, that's what we'll do. This sounds like a good fun. And then he realizes the problem that he's got. Because the problem he's got is that this guy, Daniel, who he thinks highly of, is not obeying the rules. So let's turn to Daniel's perspective. Daniel finds out, of course, that this has happened. What's he going to do? The pressure's on. For those of you who've been here through the whole series, this might be reminding you a little bit of chapter 2, where we saw Daniel's 3 friends who are under pressure to not to do something, but to do something. They're asked to bow down before this great big statue that's been built out in the desert. And if they don't, they're going to be flung in the fiery furnace. And they get flung in the fiery furnace. Do we remember that story? And it's interesting because it's similar, but it's not the same. There's all sorts of comparisons where we could say it's the same. There's somebody in there's these Judahites in power that there's a setup by those who are we might call indigenous people. And then we've got this impossible situation. Are you faithful, or do you hide away your faith? They're sentenced to death, and then they come through the other side of it. But there are a number of differences as well that we can see in this text. One is because one asks for an actual action, and the other says, don't do something. Another is that this is now Persian and not Babylonian. That's why we have lions rather than a fiery furnace. There's a number of differences that we can see. But the overall message we're going to see, which is the faithfulness of God, is exactly the same. So how does Daniel ultimately deal with this and lean into the faithfulness of God? Well, he develops habits. habits. This is one of the ways that we can live faithfully as the people of God. We see that Daniel goes in, when he finds out about this, he goes into his room where the windows open towards Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Just as he had done before. Daniel had lived under the pressure of exile his whole life. And he had flourished, as we can see. This was what God had promised through Jeremiah, if you remember our sermon on Jeremiah 29. How had he flourished? I think this is a great clue. One of the ways he flourished is that he had habits. He had habits. In this case, we're talking about prayer. We'll talk about some others in a moment. We form good habits when times are good, so that when times are difficult, we have a natural pattern of behavior. In a sporting context, they call it muscle memory. You repeat something over and over again so that when the pressure's on and the time comes, instinctively, your body will act in a certain way. Why do we pray when times are good? Why did he pray 3 times a day with his windows open towards Jerusalem? Because it formed in him habits that were repeatable even when the pressure was on. Because it became part of who he was, part of his muscle memory. Friends, we need to do the same thing. We need to have habits, faithful habits, that we can repeat over and over again. And I know the pushback against that, particularly in our nice kind of non-traditional evangelical space where, oh, that's ritual and religion. We don't like that. But we're formed by these things. They matter. And so when the pressure's on, we know what the answer is. We don't have to suddenly try and crank up a new pattern of behavior when things are difficult, when we move city, when our jobs are under threat, when new things come to us, when new children are born. We have habits and patterns that we can fall back on. We're not trying to crank them up. Habits will help us to live faithfully in exile. But specifically, Daniel prays, and I can't emphasize enough for us, prayer is at the very heart of living well in exile. Because prayer says, I can't do it. Prayer says, I believe in a God who can. Prayer says, I recognize how fallen and flawed I am and how good and faithful God is. Prayer orders the world in a particular way that helps us live in exile, gives us a perspective on the world that says, actually, I know that all that I see is not all that there is. How does Daniel pray? He prays, first of all, towards Jerusalem. And don't make a mistake about this. This isn't like a Muslim who has to pray towards Mecca, has to orient themselves in that direction. This is just a habit he's formed. Why a habit? Because Jerusalem was a symbol of hope. Jerusalem was what they longed for, the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. He used his physical posture as a way to position himself in prayer. And friends, hope matters in the midst of exile, because we will have lots of days which feel hopeless. Lots of days where it feels like I am knocking my pan in and it doesn't make any difference. Days where you will go to work and you will serve faithfully and you'll come home and think that was a waste of time. Because that's just the way life in exile feels like sometimes. So we need hope. We'll talk about what our hope is in a moment. But there's 2 other things we should notice from his prayer. Not just that it was hope-filled in the way he postured himself, but it starts by telling us that he prayed giving thanks. Isn't that wild? I'm not sure that's how I would open my prayers in these circumstances. I've been stitched up by the people that were probably my friends and colleagues. The king that I thought was on my side has now passed a law that means that I'm hooped, or I give up on my God. I can think of lots of ways I would start to pray. But we're told he gives thanks. Because again, he's got a perspective that says this is not all there is. God is still good no matter what the circumstances are. So he begins with giving thanks. And some of that, at a human level, is about us just reminding ourselves of the goodness of God in the past. It's a really healthy thing to do. I don't journal. I wish I did. I find it difficult, and it makes me have to connect with my emotions and things, and I'm far too Scottish for that. Don't want to be doing that. But one of the things I do from time to time is write down when I've seen answers to prayer. And one of the great things to be able to do is go back and look at that and say, in that day when I'm praying for something that feels beyond, right, that prayer which you're offering and you think, this feels like a bit of a stretch even for you, God. I go back and I look at some of these prayers that I've prayed before and go, oh yeah, but remember, God did that, and God did this, and God did that. Maybe, just maybe he could do this. I don't know. So we give thanks because it's the right thing to do. It changes our perspective, but it's also good for us. Just frankly, at a psychological level, it changes our perspective on things. But we know he didn't stop there, because we're told in verse 11 that when they come to, the men come, it says, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So let's not put Daniel in some sort of bubble that he was super holy and he just walked around giving thanks to God all the time, that's all he did in the midst of this difficult time. He also asked God for help. So, friends, ask God for help. Whether it's your workplace or your family or some other thing that's pressing down on you, ask God for help. There's really not much point to us singing songs like, I'm a friend of God, or God is for me, God loves me, all of this, and then we go, yeah, I'm not going to ask him for anything. Like that would be beyond. No. We need to come to him and ask for what we need. Ask for help. And it's countercultural to do this, right? It was countercultural for Daniel to do that. He was supposed to not pray. But for us, prayer is also countercultural, because it says we recognize we are not all that there is. But all of these other Christian behaviors, things like serving and giving and prophesying and loving our enemies, these things are countercultural too. And I promise you, if you don't practice those while times are good, when the pressure hits, you won't be able to just suddenly start doing it. That we need to form constantly in ourselves these habits of Christian living, service, enemy love, giving, all sorts of other things. Form habits, friends. Commit to them. They don't have to be complicated or fancy or big, and most people will never see you doing them. But they'll make a difference as you try to live faithfully in exile. And the reason we can live faithfully in exile is because of the truth that Daniel held on to and Daniel discovers to be true, which is that God is faithful. This is, in a summation, the whole story of Daniel 1-6. God is faithful. He has carried them into exile, but he is faithful. They have been thrown into a fiery furnace, but he is faithful. They've been thrown in a lion's den. God is faithful. Over and over and over again. It's not our job, friends, to be special or brilliant at something or super talented or anything else. Our calling is to trust God and trust that he is really faithful. And God showed his faithfulness in a desperate situation for Daniel. Daniel's put in this pit with caged lions. They roll a stone over this lion-filled tomb, and they seal it. Daniel's enemies had won. It was done. There's no running away from this. There's no, I could fight off lions all night, No. He's done. He's dead. You don't get away from lions. However, then came the morning, and Darius discovers he's alive. And the king orders him lifted out of this tomb of lions. God had showed his faithfulness to Daniel. Friends, Jesus had a stone rolled over his tomb. The enemy thought they'd won. But then came the morning. God, however, didn't pluck Jesus out of the tomb. He didn't avoid death. He went through death and came out the other side. He rolled back the tomb. He wasn't lifted out. He walked out of the tomb. God declared Jesus victorious. That is the good news. That is our hope. And you see, I don't know if you remember, but when the stone was rolled across Daniel's tomb, it was sealed, so he couldn't get out. There's no seal on Jesus' tomb. The only seal there is in Jesus' tomb is on the way out, and that is the seal of God's approval and vindication. This, friends, is the good news. Daniel is this little picture of being thrown in a lion's den. He's dead, and yet he lives. Jesus goes through death, comes out the other side. This is our great hope. And because Jesus defeated death, so too will we. Where, O death, is your victory, writes Paul. Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. This, friends, is our hope. This is our Jerusalem. This is where we orient ourselves, not towards a place or a building, and thank goodness not somewhere on a map. I'd never find it. But we orient ourselves to Jesus. He is our hope. It's not a place, not an idea, but a person. Jesus of Nazareth. This is how we live as faithful exiles, oriented towards Jesus, trusting in God's faithfulness. And that way, just maybe, we might learn how to live faithfully as exiles in this complicated world. Let's stand together.